Chapter 2, Part 2, Three Views of Ethics. So, in this video, we're going to investigate the question, where does the rightness or wrongness of an action come from? Another way that we can ask this same question is to ask, what makes an action right or wrong? So, what we're going to be investigating is where this rightness or wrongness of an action comes from, or what makes an action right or wrong. So one answer to this question is that this rightness or wrongness comes from a universal moral standard that exists independent of any person or society. This is called Objectivism. Another answer is that this rightness or wrongness comes from the moral beliefs and practices of particular societies. We're going to see that this is called Relativism. And a third answer to this question is that the rightness or wrongness of an action comes directly from each of us as individuals. This is going to be Subjectivism. So, a few additional considerations. Each of these views rule out the other two, okay? So, you can't sometimes be an objectivist, and sometimes be a relativist, and sometimes be a subjectivist, depending on the circumstances and what feels right, okay? So, you have to choose one view, although remember that it is totally okay to change your mind if you're feeling the pressure of some of the objections against the view. And we'll see that all three views have problems that require some kind of response. And this is an important thing to remember. All of the views have problems. None of them are perfect. And really, what we want to try to do is to figure out which view has the least problems according to each of us. So, Objectivism, Relativism, and Subjectivism are called Metaethical Views. Alright? Metaethics asks questions like, where does the rightness or wrongness of an action come from? Or, what makes an action right or wrong? This is compared to ethical theory. Ethical theory asks a similar question, but not the same, which is what actions are right and wrong. Okay, so metaethical questions, right? The meta means above here, right? Metaethical questions ask, where does rightness or wrongness come from? Whereas ethical questions ask, is a particular action right or wrong? Okay, so there are three different views in metaethics. There's Objectivism. This is the view that there's only one universal moral standard. This standard, based on objective moral facts, consists of moral values and principles that hold universally for all people and all societies. Relativism holds that there can be different moral standards for different societies. Each standard, based on that society's moral beliefs and practices, consists of moral values and principles that hold for all members of that particular society. And then there's Subjectivism. This is the view that there can be different moral standards for different people. Each standard based on that person's moral beliefs and practices at a given time. And this consists of the moral values and principles that hold for this person at this particular time. All right. Now note that none of these views are talking about principles from other normative realms, such as law or etiquette, which unquestionably vary across societies. And these three views are also not concerned with the rich diversity of institutions, dress, religious beliefs, and non-normative values that distinguish various cultures and traditions. Metaethical views and metaethical theories aren't interested in these particular things. Each metaethical view is talking exclusively about moral principles and values and where they come from. Remember that the question that we're considering is, where does the rightness or wrongness of an action come from, or what makes an action right or wrong? So what is it that makes the action right or wrong, or where is it that this rightness or wrongness comes from? Objectivism holds that there's only one valid moral standard that holds for all human beings. This objective moral standard is where the rightness or wrongness of an action come from. It's this objective moral standard that's making the action right or wrong. If it's wrong for one person to lie in a particular situation, it's wrong for every person to lie in the same situation, regardless of where they live or how they think or feel about their actions. This is because there's a universal moral standard that's making this action wrong that holds in all instances of this action. Objectivism holds that there's one set of universal moral standards, regardless of what anyone believes or practices. Now, objectivism doesn't mean that people must all act exactly the same way, no matter what the circumstances are at a particular time. It's possible to develop a more sophisticated account of objectivism, where the same moral principles can lead to different obligations in different situations, and this is important to keep in mind. For instance, suppose that the objective moral standard entails that lying is wrong, and that human life has great moral value. Two things that I think that, broadly speaking, most of us hold. Now, it would follow that everyone normally has a duty to tell the truth and to avoid harming others, following from this objective moral standard. But, in a situation where telling the truth would lead to someone's death, objectivism could require that we lie rather than risk someone's life. This is perfectly coherent according to objectivism, or at least it can be. So this doesn't mean that it's right to lie just because in this situation the right thing to do was lie, or that there isn't an objective moral standard against lying in most situations. So this is just something important to keep in mind about objectivism, that it's possible to develop more sophisticated accounts where the same moral principles can lead to different obligations in different situations. In fact, I think most of us would require a more sophisticated account to begin to accept objectivism at all. All right, on to relativism. Moral relativism denies that moral standards are universal. Instead, relativism maintains that there can be different but equally valid moral standards for different cultures or social groups. So, it can be right in one culture to act one way, while the very same action is wrong in another culture. Relativism does insist, however, that all who belong to a given group are bound to their group's moral standard, whether or not they agree with its values and principles. And this is an important part of relativism. What actually is right for everyone in that society is what the majority of this society accepts as right. Now, we need to keep this in mind when we are thinking that our moral standards are coming, strictly speaking, from our society. Right? If we accept that, then it means that what actually is right for everyone is what that society says is right. Okay, now moving on to subjectivism. Subjectivism maintains that there can be different but equally valid moral standards for different people, even within the same society. So, there's no guarantee that the moral standard for any two people will match, nor is there any guarantee that a person's present moral principles will be the same a year from now. Subjectivism makes moral standards entirely dependent on each individual at any given time. Now, this metaethical view is often very popular in our ethics classroom because it allows different people to hold different ethical beliefs. However, in our next video, we're going to consider a number of very strong challenges to subjectivism. Now, it's still totally okay to accept subjectivism as your metaethical view. However, you need to have good responses to these objections. All right, to review, we've looked at three views of metaethics. Objectivism, which says there's only one universal moral standard, and this standard is based on objective moral facts and consists of moral values and principles that hold universally for all people and all societies. Relativism holds that there can be different moral standards for different societies, each standard based on that society's moral beliefs and practices, and these consist of the moral values and principles that hold for all members of that particular society. And finally, subjectivism. Subjectivism is the view that there can be different moral standards for different people at different times. Each standard is based on that person's moral beliefs and practices at a given time, and it consists of the moral values and principles that hold for that person at that time. So we remember that the question that we're asking ourselves is what it is that makes a right action right or a wrong action wrong. And when we look at these three options, it's either objectivism, that there's one universal moral standard, it's relativism, that there's different moral standards for different societies, or subjectivism, that there's different moral standards for different people. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a question. Where do you think rightness or wrongness come from? Do you think that there are objective moral standards? Or do you think that our moral standards come from our culture or social group? Or do you think that there are different but equally valid moral standards for different people, even within the same society? Now, why do you think this?